Alan. I'm Dean Bubley from Disruptive Analysis. I've spoken at a couple of these events before, and I'm generally what Alan describes as a curmudgeon. Now, for people who don't speak English, a curmudgeon is someone who complains about everything and is generally cynical. And as a result, I'm probably the only analyst here. In fact, sometimes I use another term that actually Alan doesn't like. I cover a few different areas. I cover a bunch of stuff around networks, everything like 5G and policy and spectrum and all that. The stuff in the middle, which is what I'm going to talk about today, which is communications, particularly real-time communications, voice, video, also messaging, platforms, WebRTC, a lot of people will know me for. But I also do stuff which I refer to as telco futurism, or for the benefit of Alan, corporate astrology, which is where telecoms intersects all the other fun stuff like AI and drones and blockchain and AR and VR and stuff like that. And a couple of bits of that will feature in what I'm talking about. Now, I need to make a bit of an apology. I had to put this presentation together pretty quickly because a family member was ill over the weekend. So it's got bits and pieces in here that hopefully all stick together. The theme that I'm going to talk about is really reflective of the world overall. The world is, if you like, polarizing between open and closed, establishment and anti-establishment, and I've used a couple of flags there. You might recognize Denmark, and the green and red one, I don't know if anyone knows that one, that's Belarus. So I'm picking two countries in Europe that are probably diametrically opposite. And I see the same occurring both in a political sense, but also in a communications and voice and messaging environment as well. And there's a book I read recently which had a great quote, which is, "The 21st century is a terrible time to be a control freak." And the risk is that if you look back in history, the telecoms industry has been, let's just say, there've been a lot of control freaks. I'm not going to call out, all right, yes, I am going to call out various organizations as being part of the establishment here. I was at a spectrum policy meeting a couple of weeks ago talking about frequencies for 5G, and there were some people from ITU and a number of other organizations, and you know that you're dealing with the establishment when they talk about exciting and really rushed 3.5-year processes to come up with an agenda item for a conference in 2019. So this is the sort of the telecoms establishment that, frankly, it's having to deal with quite a lot of things going on. If you're a telco at the moment, there's a lot of stuff that's complicated, and they all ultimately relate to voice and video as well, but they distract you. There's this obvious shift to IP networks for all sorts of reasons, move to, deploying, whether it's fiber or 5G or, still 4.5G. I was at an event yesterday, a lot of people talking about the software telco and NFV, and at the same time, and I've got some stats in a minute, that they're facing the death of traditional phone calls and SMS. There's more in the application to person, but there's certainly problems elsewhere. And so we get some of the telecoms community looking at doing what we saw earlier on with IdeaMart and others that are looking to reach out to innovators and developers. And then I think in the future that there will be some of this, the other cool stuff. And actually, although some of it is a little bit sci-fi, I think that's where some of the differentiation is going to come. It's going to be where we're able to create things that can't be created by other people because there are too many possibilities. So, the question though is telecoms too important to leave to the telcos? And certainly if you look at this community and what Alan does with TADHack, it would seem that there are plenty of other players. And I know from the work that I do, that's not just in voice and video messaging, but it's also on the network side as well, but that's for another session. So, a little bit of background. I'm not sure how well this comes out from the back of the room. I've referred to this term peak telephony before. But this is the phenomenon of ordinary phone calls declining in usage despite prices coming down. These charts are it's an analysis that very few people seem to bother to do, which is adding together fixed and mobile calls. In this case, I've done 4 countries in Europe. And France is the outlier because phone calls used to be a lot more expensive. They got cheaper with newer mobile competition with the 4th entrant a couple of years ago. But in Germany, UK and Spain, we've seen roughly 10% decline in the total number of minutes. This is total over the last 5 years. And this is despite plummeting phone calls, unlimited bundles, all the rest of it. People make less phone calls. And the reason isn't that they're communicating less, they're communicating more. But they're doing it with messages, they're doing it on net with voice over IP applications, or conferencing in and UC as a service and enterprise. And this is a huge issue because it means that the telephony 1.0, which is the core of the establishment, is starting to crumble. And if the prices are coming down and volumes are coming down, it doesn't take a world economist to tell you that the margins are almost non-existent, and that's true in wholesale as well. And the response to this from the mainstream telecoms industry has been Volte and voice over Wi-Fi, which is an awful lot of smoke and not much fire. The main uses are boring. Volte is phone calls for 4G networks. It might have a benefit of allowing some of the mobile operators to refarm their spectrum from old 2G, 3G to 4G networks at some point. Voice over Wi-Fi, yeah, it gives a bit of better indoor coverage. But if you look at the statistics, there's not actually that much of it. And in Vodafone in the UK, single-digit percentage of calls are using one of these technologies. Probably the leader is probably T-Mo in the US. But the problem is there's no new revenue. There's no innovation. It's still a phone call. It's telephony 1.1. It's establishment again. So what about SMS? And obviously we have quite a lot of interesting things around things like two-factor authentication, and we just saw applications for SMS. The establishment, meanwhile, is still trying to do this thing it's failed to do for the last 9 years, called RCS. And RCS is what I call a zombie technology. It's undead. It's not even dead properly. But it's still slowly moving around, and it is trying to eat your brain. And it's eaten Google's brain. They bought Jibe. It ate Samsung's brain yesterday. They just bought what used to be called NewPace as a platform. And yet, as far as I can tell, the active user base, and RCS is this supposed replacement for SMS, GSMS has been trying to push, GSMA's been trying to push for years. I think that fax is still a larger user base active than RCS in terms of next generation messaging. The only thing to do with the zombie, and it is a bit early in the day, and people will recognise that the reference from the movie is let's go to the Winchester and have a pint and wait for it all to blow over. Seriously, there are attempts by various people in the telecoms community to sort of shoehorn this RCS messaging into things like emergency, next-gen 112 emergency calling, yet there's no popular usage of it. And I can't think what's going to make a teenager switch from using Snapchat to using Messenger Plus from Vodafone or whatever the other equivalent on other networks are. It's just a sink of time for the industry and money on an ongoing basis. Frankly, I don't quite understand why Google bought Jibe unless it's trying to create essentially the Android version of iMessage. So, what are the other options for the establishment? What do all these technologies have in common? Any guesses? They're all dead. Ah, Abacus is still good. And fax, as I said. Actually, what are they all? They're all digital. So, whenever you see anyone in the telecoms industry saying, the future is digital, actually, the past is digital. I was at a conference yesterday, and it was on telecoms, and actually they had an analog way of doing voting on propositions. They had a piece of cardboard with green on one side and red on the other, and that was much better than some digital conference tool, which I would have seen at some other events. So digital isn't saving the establishment either. But luckily, the one good thing to come out of 2016 is we know that the anti-establishment is actually quite effective these days. And we might not necessarily like all of its figureheads, but there's no denying that sort of kicking against the sort of old received wisdom seems to work, at least at a political level. So what is cool? What is anti-establishment? What's different that's going on at the moment? And I've just collected a few things, and I'm not sure from the back of the room if everyone's going to see them. These are some of the cool things I've been seeing in communications this year. These are primarily consumer-oriented. I have to say, I mean, I find the sort of Amazon Echo and Alexa a little bit clunky to use, but it's evolving really, really fast. And you know, I was at an AI conference in San Francisco last week and talked to one of the Amazon people, and you know, that's just a starting point for where we're going. There's a concept called sensor fusion, where it's not just going to listen to your voice, but it'll be aware of how many people there are in a room. There's a link between this and sort of Wi-Fi around the house, and Google's doing something similar to do cloud Wi-Fi that can add in security, contextual awareness of the layout of your house to make sure you've got good Wi-Fi in it. Potentially it's a security overlay, which will flag up if your toaster is uploading 2 gigabytes to the internet and has 1,000 TCP connections. It might look to block that. So as well as communications, it's going to be a hub for potentially a sort of home of the future. So I'm not sure exactly where we're going to go with it, but the speech interfaces are really one to watch. And I think embedding them into bits of the environment, frankly, actually this one works okay, but the number of events I go to where the microphones don't work, or else people stand over here and somehow expect the microphone to magically be aware, whereas in fact you could do a motion sensor in the microphone that actually directionally works out that I'm away from it. So I think that we're going to see a lot of advances in the broader sense of communication that come out of things like Amazon Alexa and also Cortana and Siri and so on. Other stuff here, for some unknown reason, the key thing that seems to be cool in messaging at the moment is adding rabbit ears and tongues and noses to your image, face swap and filters. Does anyone know the much cooler spectacles in the top right corner? They're not Google Glass. Snapchat. They're Snapchat spectacles, which are basically Google Glass reinvented for the cool kids, sold in a vending machine, in pop-up vending machines in random locations around the US, allowing you to have to video the world from your face, but actually to let people know you're doing it. It's got little LEDs that circle around to actually sort of mean that people know that they're on camera, and they're funky colours as well. Live streaming seems to be, video live streaming seems to be this year's thing in terms of video communications. It's sort of one way, but it encourages interaction. And I think that this blending of real-time and non-real-time is a hallmark of quite a few communications applications I'm seeing, where you've got sort of hyper voice, hyper video of you create some perhaps one-way or two-way session, and then people can then archive it, comment on it, search it, tag it, keyword it later. You definitely can't see on this screen the sort of rather boring-looking menu on the far left is actually the commerce page on the Chinese WeChat Messenger. And what it's got on there is, WeChat is the sort of the successful example of messaging as a platform. There are millions of people booking taxi rides with it and paying for taxi rides within the Messenger application. And that's the thing that, well, to some extent you could, maybe Google and GSMA are trying to do with RCS, but you also get with Facebook, with WhatsApp and other messenger tools, trying to create this sort of embedded applications in the messaging stream. I suppose it's sort of like a consumer equivalent to Slack in some ways, where you have more of a timeline metaphor with embedded mini applications. Other stuff that's interesting, we're starting to get the first VR and AR communications and conferencing tools emerge. That is not easy because the latency requirements, if you've got a VR headset in, versus the network round trip time, means you need to do some really clever things to stop you feeling sick, because you are aware of the milliseconds. And so what we may end up doing is using some sort of edge computing or again AI type approach, where you have maybe a wireframe of a face, putting videos, reconstructing video by putting 2D images over it and reconstructing it and rendering it locally. So there's going to be some quite interesting processing challenges there. Other things, the laptop is Skype's real-time translation tool. I saw a demo of that, and I think that translation in the cloud or on the device is going to really fundamentally change a lot of the ways we communicate. I know it's something that Docomo in Japan is trying to do for the Olympics in 2020, of being able to have real-time translation in the cloud, which is important because the sort of foreign language skills in Japan are not huge, and certainly during the Olympics there's going to be a lot of need for interpreters, and so being able to do that in a seamless, well, I hate that word, convenient and frictionless fashion is going to be good. The last logo, Iris, it's a company I met last week, and this is interesting because whilst there's value in person-to-person communication, just whether it's voice or video or messaging, is extracting context is really important too. And I think one of the sources of context, and particularly in video, is facial expressions. And so they're developing software which is not just based on an OS, can even be embedded into a chip or a camera to do facial recognition, micro-expression recognition, so emotional analysis, and eye tracking. So some of the use cases are quite creepy. Some of them are going to be fascinating, where you'll be able to have conferencing tools that tell you how much attention people are paying. Whether more interestingly, perhaps in a business environment, they'll tell you which bits of your web page or your tool people are actually looking at. If you're creating advertising, are people looking at the message and the product, or are they looking at the model on the other side of the screen? There's a couple of interesting demos I've seen with that, and I think that we'll start to see these capabilities integrated into more and more communications and also entertainment apps as well. And I think in a business context, you're starting to get some more interesting contextual communications use cases. I think you have one way, what's being called whisper mode, so you can imagine that you're a salesperson on a call with a client, and that will maybe listen to the analytics on the call, what the tone is someone going, yeah, yeah, and you might have one way whisper saying, call back later, they're not interested, or they're busy, or close the sale now, or ask them out on a date. Whatever it happens to be. And I think that interaction of intelligence in the media stream is going to be important. You're going to be, again, having emotional detection of looking for things like anger in a contact center. I always thought, actually, that a telecom company could make more money by charging you double for phone calls if you're shouting, because it's obviously more important. But maybe that one's not gonna fly. I think regulators might have something to say about that. But also sort of integration with wearables, with sensors like motion sensors. The person you're speaking to is at the airport and running. Would you like to schedule a call for 2 hours' time? I think the ability to fuse multiple data streams to come up with useful forms of communication mean that the fact that the minutes of use are going down and the price of minutes is going down will be unimportant, because the source of value is in making a better communications call or a session. And it's thinking about what's the purpose, what's the utility, what's the value, and how do you improve that through the application. A few other things. I think one of the interesting things is not all sound and audio is speech. There's quite a few people doing medical diagnostics apps either using video to things like looking for cataracts, or using audio patterns for breathing analysis. I saw one demo recently, which was an infrared camera linked into WebRTC to use sort of for I don't know, looking for leaks in your insulation for your house. That's not what we normally think about video and visual usage.
We did that last year in TEDx.
Did you do that last year? Ah, okay. Right. So that's the term contextual communications gets used by many people, and there's a lot of different things about context. Context can mean communications in an application. So you're in the social network, you're in the vertical market application for hotels, or it can be using contextual data. And I think it's the latter stuff that we're going to see more interesting stuff going on. I think one of the things in the background that's happening is Apple's Korkut API, which allows other voice over IP applications to be the primary communications app on an iPhone. Obviously, it's been possible for a while with Android as well, but I think that Apple adopting it is going to lead to a sort of a greater shift in quite a few sectors. I've noticed it the other day where my Skype calls were appearing in my call log, and I think that's got potential both on consumer, particularly enterprise side of things. On enterprise, I think, and I don't have time to talk about all this, is unified comms as a service, so hosted PBX and beyond, I think intersects with a ton of trends. And I think actually, in some ways, there's more going on in enterprise real-time communications that's interesting than consumer. And you've got everything from the network side around security and software-defined WAN to new stuff going on in contact centers, workstream integration with a timeline metaphor, variety of platform and service. You've got Vonage and Nexmo acquisition and Cisco Tropo, and there's assorted other partnerships there as well. Avaya has got its own platform, Zang. There's quite a lot of intersections between the enterprise comms world and the platform as a service, and also WebRTC, which I'm running out of time, so I'm going to rapidly rattle through. You might be surprised that I'm not talking as much about WebRTC this year as I have in the past. Partly it's because I've been doing a lot of other things, but also because WebRTC is now sort of part of the background. When you look at some of the applications you saw, I know Groupama's Grand Village, for example, that's WebRTC behind the scenes. And although I saw a logo on the screen, it doesn't need to talk about it. All of the messaging applications have video chat now. I saw WhatsApp launched yesterday. There's billions of endpoints. There's still some of the browsers, particularly older ones, don't support it. But most smartphones can support WebRTC embedded into applications. You probably have several on your phone now, including WhatsApp probably. So there's now billions of endpoints, and there's certainly hundreds of millions of people using WebRTC at least say once a month, and probably tens, maybe even now hundreds of millions using it on an almost day-to-day basis. So as a technology, WebRTC allows developers to put voice and video into applications, into websites, including mobile apps, either developing it themselves. There's a lot of open source tools out there, but there's also a ton of platform as a service players that allow that. Where I'd say there's not been as much movement over the last year has been the integration with the telecoms network. There's a few use cases, but most of the WebRTC use I'm seeing at the moment is integrating with maybe corporate conferencing services. It's built into social and messaging apps, or vertical solutions like banking and insurance. So not really gatewaying out into the outside world as much. So last slide, what's up next? I think that we're going to see a whole array of touch points between real-time comms and the Internet of Things. And the way of thinking about it is saying that there's a bunch of sort of styles of communication, whether it's an ordinary call to person A speaks to person B, whether it's non-voice audio, could be music and karaoke, contextual data around communications, video of varying sorts, whether it's streaming or two-way, AR and VR is coming fairly quickly, messaging and platforms. And then think for each of the sort of IoT verticals, whether that's in a vehicle, whether that's industrial, whether it's wearable, drones, agriculture technology. There's touch points at each of those intersections. Some will happen faster, some won't be. You'll find in-vehicle communications will be already important. You already have Bluetooth integration for a start, but that will move to a whole array of other interesting things with maybe autonomous vehicles, industrial IoT. There's some really interesting things where you might have preventative maintenance, and a temperature sensor in a machine might cross a threshold and trigger a call between a supervisor and an engineer to go check it out before it breaks. And maybe they have a video to make sure it's not on fire, or an audio, they're doing audio analytics, so if it's going whoa, 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 clonk, whoa, 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 clonk, that might be from an AI, a machine learning system, could work out that it's about to fail in the next day. And so, you can essentially add 2% to global GDP if you stop things breaking rather than fixing them afterwards. So communications is going to be pervasive. It's not about boring old phone calls. It's not about the establishment. It's about thinking differently how voice, video, and messaging can actually add value to what you want to do. Thank you.